It's funny. I think Jack, remind me where you're calling
California,
from.
but I grew up in Minnesota, so no stranger to the snow.
No, it's funny. I feel like all the East Coast folks, myself included, are flipping out about it. But then I see like 6 feet in Tahoe, and it's like, oh man, like we have no idea.
Yeah, that's a different level for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So the Californians might be joining, possibly have the most snow of all. Amazing. So I think in a second. We'll have a couple of slides to walk through, and as we go through these, if we want to throw on those slides, I think the main kind of like ask and ground rules for everyone joining is, we're going to be sharing elements of kind of like a survey that we've run, personal anecdotes and experience. We'll intro ourselves in a second, but everyone here is unique experience working at orgs of different sizes, and part of making this like a really helpful and collaborative experience for everyone is going to include hearing from you as well. So we're going to be pretty reliant on the chat as well. We want to hear from you about what you've seen work well, and if everyone's participating and everyone's volunteering their opinions, I think it'll be an even more informative and helpful experience for everyone. So I think next slide with that, I want to go over like a couple of organizing like agenda of what we're trying to do today. So Jack and I will introduce ourselves in a second, but I think the primary goal of this is sharing some insights on finance team composition from a survey that we ran recently. And along the way, as I mentioned, we're going to layer in personal anecdotes and frameworks from different sizes and stages of finance orgs that we've worked in. And lastly, and most importantly, we want to hear from y'all as well. So with that, I'll spend a little bit of time talking a little bit about us. So my name is Craig Thompson. I run our finance function here at Aleph. I've worked at Aleph, which is about a 70 employee org today. So right on the cusp, and having just passed the cusp and at least one of our benchmarks that we'll run through. Prior to this, I've worked with very big multi-billion-dollar companies. Started my career as an investment banker at Goldman Sachs. Was a private equity investor at KKR. And so from the operator hat, I've seen a lot of the like 0 to 100. Then a lot of this is more anecdotal on like the 100 to 500 plus. So that's where we're hoping to lean on y'all. And Jack, I'll let you introduce yourself. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, there we go. Thanks, Greg, and great to meet everybody here, and really appreciate you all joining. Yeah, I'm Jack. I'm market sales team here at Anrok. We're about 130 person org, Series C. Yeah, I got my start in management consulting, moved quickly into revenue operations, and then couldn't resist jumping into the sales org. So I've been doing that ever since, and love it. So I'm excited to get started and talk a little bit more about sales tax as it pertains to company stages and growth. So we'll hit on that closer to the end.
Perfect. And one fun thing that you'll see that we're going to do at the end is, I think, we're going to start in kind of like the theoretical of like benchmarking again, like we want to hear from everyone else here, kind of like what your experience has been. But then as it comes to things you're starting to think about as you scale, like perhaps for some of the more earlier stage startup folks, like a preview of problems you might face that you're going to scale. Jack and I are actually going to run through kind of like a live example that we thought would be fun of like how to think about like sales tax software, where, Jack obviously coming with his Anrok hat on, and me, being a decision maker at an org that currently does our sales tax ourselves and we don't pay for software. So we figured it'd be fun to kind of run through that thought experiment of just like one example of something of like what you might be thinking about, and Jack and I haven't pre-scripted that part. So it's going to be really good improv, and you never know what's going to happen. Maybe I'll walk out of here with some new software. So with that, excited to dive in here. So the foundation of what we did was really looking at B2B companies that went through Y Combinator at some point. We looked at basically a little over 200 of these orgs and tried to get like an even distribution of about kind of like 50 in each of these buckets of kind of like the 5 to 50 employee range, 51 to 250, 251 to 500, and 500 plus. Ultimately, as we all know, headcount is a kind of an odd proxy for a lot of these things. Like you might want to triangulate between, revenue, growth, headcount. There's all these other metrics that you might care about. But I think in terms of what was, readily publicly available and reliable, I think this is like a great benchmark. And the first thing that I think stood out to me is of all of these companies, 75% had at least one full-time finance team member, which is actually like kind of low if you are thinking about it, or I guess like potentially high, if you think about it from like the AI context. But a lot of these orgs, went through YC between 2015 and 2025. So I did find that to be kind of an interesting statistic. So first, I'd love to hear in the chat from folks like how many of you are at an org that is this size today, this like 5 to 50 range. And if I hear crickets, then maybe I'll assume that no one here, is a finance team member at a company this size, which I think is in some ways borne out by the data. So in this case, if you're, companies this size, it's really rare to have a full-time, finance team member. That was certainly the case for us, where the idea is, we work with, when we were at this stage, and it's still true today, working with kind of like a fractional accounting resource. A lot of orgs have kind of like founder-led finance. And then if there is a full-time finance team member, it's someone who wears multiple hats. I think for companies at this stage, when you're trying to, allocate resources efficiently, it's really hard to justify expensive headcount for a non-revenue or product generating role. I think, there's this great trope in startups of, there are people who sell, there are people who build, and then there's other. And I do think that we're sort of at this early stage. There is a lot of impetus to try to minimize and reduce the dollar cost going into the other bucket, and try to keep headcount lean so you're investing for growth. As I try to think about kind of like nudges of like where our finance muscle was really focused at this point in time. When I joined Aleph, there were only 14 people at the company, and so having seen, a lot of how we've scaled through this time, I think really a lot of the focus was on, thinking about efficiency metrics, thinking about CAC payback, thinking about, burn multiple, and then also thinking about just like revenue efficiency and hyper detailed on everything for how kind of like the top line is growing. Again, I'd love to hear from any folks in this range, but sounds like, people aren't there, which I think is like, coincides with what we were seeing in the data. So with that, we'll go to the next bucket. I'm sort of guessing that these next two will be probably like the most common and most popular among attendees. Would love to hear from folks, if you are working at a company that is this company range, would love to hear how many full-time finance team members y'all have. And the second question I'm interested to hear is, who is that team member? Is it basically like after the first hire, is that first hire someone who's scaled through startups? Is it someone that comes from more of like an accounting or an investment banking background? And then the related question is, in those first hires, how much do you think about it being, more on the accounting side, more on the FP&A side? And while we do that, just running through like a little bit of what the data says here. So I think this starts to be kind of like the point where companies hit scale. I think this is where Jack and I will dig into like a couple of examples of where you're starting to think about, what types of software tools you need. At what point, do you want some things to continue to live in maybe a G Sheet or Excel world? And at what point do you want it to, be more scaled? And what's the right balance there? So Chris, you're squarely in this bucket. And yeah, it's I guess really a 5-person team, which is smack in the middle of what the data says is typical, where 4 to 6 is kind of the typical, led by a CFO or VP. So in this case, CFO, controller, an FP&A manager, an accounting manager, and an operational, and I guess operational accounting team. Maybe is that full time or one person? But yeah, in that like 4 or 5 person range, and then perfect, full time and offshore is nice. And then Justin, yeah, 25. There is a finance lead and a contractor for APAR. I guess Justin, the other thing, and maybe you are the finance lead. What I'd be curious to hear what percentage of your time is on finance topics, and what percentage time is on other, and maybe also like what your desired balance would be. Like I know there's like you're probably getting pulled in a lot of directions, and both like what you feel like you could be doing or should be doing, and what you're actually doing. I think I'll also be curious to hear. As we think about kind of like this, size range. And by the way, Aleph, we're in this range, so we have basically our finance team is me, and it's probably like 70% of me still. It's still not even like quite 100%. So I think we're still really focused on trying to leverage tools and automation in a lot of cases where we can. But I'll talk in a second about kind of like the areas of pull where I feel like we're kind of like dragging, and even how we're thinking about this hiring decision. Yeah. So yeah, Justin, 50% finance, treasury, and accounting, 25% HR, 25% hodgepodge. That sounds like, welcome to the world of 25-person companies. And it sounds like perfect description of, in a lot of ways, kind of what I was doing too. So I think we're all in good company here. As we at Aleph think about this size range, I think this starts to be where a lot of the really interesting decisions come, because I think, Chris, having had an example of probably like double our overall headcount and kind of this like median kind of like finance team size, I will say a lot of how we're thinking about things internally is really a bias towards automating whatever we can, leveraging tooling whatever we can, and really trying to minimize what sort of long-term enduring commitment we have to full-time headcount. With that, I do think areas where we're starting to see some pull that are starting to get like a little bit messy, I think definitely on the accounting side, I think like revenue recognition in like a structured way is something that we're improving on. Really accurate accruals, I think, is another thing that's starting to become a little bit more of a pain point for us, because we care so much about CAC payback. It's really important that we have the accruals right when we look historically at where we're allocating costs. So these are, I think, like some things where we're starting to feel a little bit pulled. And then the other thing I think is really around kind of like billing and tracking is kind of like a B2B SaaS company. I think like the billing kind of like life cycle of quote to cash, I think, is definitely an area that we focus on. On the FP&A side, I think we're doing a ton of work there. We're obviously leveraging Aleph internally ourselves for that. And all throughout all of these, I do think, the company is changing a lot. We're growing a lot. And spreadsheets just continue to be a really big part of the process. So I think that's one other thing I'd love to hear from folks is how much of you, like maybe you could give like employee range, like number of FTEs, and then how much of your finance org is reliant on spreadsheets, I think is like another interesting question I'd be keen to hear. As we're going through this, by the way, I hope that you'll be able to submit Q&A and questions along the way. So I think it's like the chat is a great place to ask questions. There's also a little place for Q&A on the right. And again, I want to make this collaborative. I want to make this interactive. And hear a little bit about you all are kind of going through all of this too. Yeah, so Alonzo, this is now kind of like a great, sort of like right at that in-between point at the high end of this range, low end of the next range, where it's about 50-50 between Excel and between systems. And I really think like that mix feels, and so we'll call like Excel and G Sheets. I think like that mix, I think, really feels, once you start getting to 100 FTEs, maybe under 100, I think it's like a lot of spreadsheets, potentially an FP&A tool, might even be an FP&A tool that's like leveraging spreadsheets. Once you start getting over 100 employees, I think that's where that starts to be a mix, and they start making decisions and start making trade-offs. I think one of the fascinating things with systems for companies of this size, especially for orgs like many of ours that are growing pretty significantly, or the business model is changing, is how you think about trade-offs of like structure and flexibility and those sorts of tools. But that is a great segue to starting to talk a little bit larger, a little bit scaled. And by the way, like now that we're starting to get into this 250 plus org, I would say that like 251 to 500 is really the bucket where I talk with a lot of our clients who are in this space. I think this is like very much a sweet spot for where Aleph starts to get used as a product. But it is an area where I personally, as a finance leader, don't have direct expertise. So really excited to hear from folks in the chat how y'all are thinking about that sort of work as well. On the team side, I think this is where we start to see, maybe these like 2-4 person teams starting to get a lot bigger. And this is the first time that we start having a multi-layered finance org. I think, under 250, it's a lot of kind of like ICs potentially with a CFO or a VP of finance that's orchestrating things. I think now we're starting to get in the range where there might be different layers of different types of things where people are focused. And this is also, I think, like one of the areas where we have started seeing AI creep more and more into handling not really 100% of somebody's job, but it's starting to be, larger and larger percentages, so that for some of these orgs that might have, 3 FP&A analysts, on a go forward basis, right sizing that headcount might go from 3 down to 1 or 2. I think any place in this stack where it's kind of like one person, I think AI can add a lot of leverage. I think it can really help. But I don't think we've yet seen any specific cases of going from like 1 to 0. But now I do think we're starting to get into cases where we've seen 5 to 3, 3 to 2, and that sort of leverage, which I think is like a great segue to how do you think about what are the things that AI is good at? I think this is one of those topics that I think is very buzzy and very interesting. I'll give my personal perspective, but while I do, I really want to hear from you all as well as like how you're seeing AI adopted in the org, and not just like where are the pilots, but where you're seeing impact and where you're seeing leverage. I think this is also one of those topics where, as I think about kind of like the various like Slack communities for finance folks that I'm in, I think this is kind of like an area where everyone's sort of looking around and trying to wonder like, what are you doing? What are you doing? Like, I haven't seen, my team go from 10 to 1, like, and based on my LinkedIn feed, I feel like I should. So what's going on there? But I think, with that, a couple of like frameworks that I personally, use, have seen other people, talk about and really like is, what are things that LLMs are good at? I think one thing that LLMs are not good at is being a system of record. I think at the end of the day, as you start to think about your ERP, as you start to think about a CRM, as you start to think about like an HR, like information system, as you start to think about a data warehouse, these at the end of the day, I think basically with 100%, share are still a deterministic tool. I think I saw this like terrible, post on Reddit that just gave me so much anxiety about someone, posting how they learned that the AI they'd been using had been making up analytics data. And it just like, I can't imagine being in that case where you're realizing that after months of having leveraged it. And it's just like, I think everyone on this call is like, just imagining that happening like really doesn't feel good. So I think at the end of the day, the system of record still has to be software. And I think a lot of that software can leverage LLMs and AI for components of how it gets updated. But my personal philosophy is that every action that happens in any system of record needs a human owner. So you basically like need someone full-time in accounting who's kind of closing the books, might be leveraging AI to help with that. And I think there's a ton of ways where that can happen, but there always has to be a human in the loop reviewing and approving and owning everything that goes in that system. You need kind of like that system to be that single source of truth, and it kind of has to be there. So that's where I think like LLMs in like the system of record context, I would think of as really an intern. It's someone who you can't rely on for like actual work, but might be able to help you along the way. You review it, but you review it with this kind of lens of skepticism. I think like the second thing that I think is like really interesting is querying source data. Now that you have this system of record, what are you doing on top of that? You're trying to pull a report, build an analysis, kind of like show something. And I think that the LLMs are really good at describing variance. But when you're actually like running and pulling the data, this was that kind of like Reddit thing of like, it was making up information and there was no audit trail. I maybe this is even still like a little bit of a hot take in this era. I think anytime you're querying data or running an analysis, I think that analysis has to be deterministic. I think it has to be deterministic because you have to be able to go down to the source data and validate, is this right? There has to be like a real chain of command there of like, here is my operating margin. And if I wanted to double check that this is the operating margin, I need to see like every number and every subcomponent that goes into that. And I need those numbers to come directly from a system of record where a human owner kind of like validated that. So yeah, again, like I'd love to hear kind of like if anyone agrees or like disagrees with that take, but that is sort of like the framework for me of basically thinking like, as we're kind of building our finance team and we're thinking about where people belong, I think more and more as you have a workflow that is taking more than one person's time, I still think we're in this world where in these 50 to 250 person orgs, I don't think we're going to see so much material change in who we hire. The only caveat that I can imagine is more athletes potentially. Like I think if you can have someone who has sort of like controller level, experience and expertise that can also manage, agent interns that are working on billing. Like that would be an example where I could see potentially taking that, full-time ARAP resource, making it fractional, or taking a fractional ARAP resource and maybe trying to like avoid that and just scale the bandwidth of one person. But at this 250, to 500 person orgs, you're starting to see bigger teams and you're now maybe saying that like, yes, this one human owner of the workflow can actually own more things. They have more bandwidth. And so there's scale and efficiency there, which by the way, I think like might mean smaller teams, but I think it means so much more leverage and value for the top quartile performers who people trust to own multiple processes. So I'm actually really excited about the opportunity that this presents for folks that are willing to roll up their sleeves and own more things. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. So now we're kind of in this like deterministic querying of data, but man, LLMs are great at analysis. I think everyone who isn't using, in particular, Claude for Excel, who isn't using kind of like an FP&A tool that runs a lot of like AI variance analysis for you, everyone that isn't using even like ChatGPT or Claude to ask questions about their data. I think it's just really good at analysis when you know the numbers are what they are and you want to like interpret and analyze it. I think they're really good at this. And this is where I would even say that LLMs can do not just like analyst level work, but they can do associate level work. And what I mean by that is, there's still sort of this like VP framework who's like reviewing all the analysis, reviewing all the commentary, making sure it's suitable and appropriate for the audience to whom you're presenting. But in terms of building and writing a lot of that commentary, I do think it's pretty good. The last thing I wanted to like talk about in this framework, which is really thinking about actually building a model itself, as you're thinking not just about analyzing historical data, but budgeting and forecasting going forward. I use Claude for Excel all the time. I cannot believe how good it is at like, banking associate level work. When you bring in Claude and ask it to analyze like a 10 tab, pretty complicated Excel model, I'm like blown away at how good it is at analyzing it. It's great at catching errors. It's great at formatting. It's great at spotting edge cases. I don't really trust it to build a model. So for any folks here who come from like investment banking backgrounds, I think like one of the funny things about especially like bulge bracket investment banking is there's this weird dynamic where like the associates are kind of like the indirect, dotted line bosses to the analysts, but the analysts tend to like be the only ones who know how to model. Like I feel like a lot of associates are MBAs who are kind of like learning kind of as they go. They don't quite have the expertise that the analysts have, but their job is basically to audit and review these models. And I think actually that like Claude for Excel is much better at model auditing and review work than a person. Just like the process of opening up an Excel model that you didn't build and figure out what's going on is not fun. And LM's are really good at that. But I don't really trust them to build the model, again, because I sort of view your budget forecast as its own kind of like source of truth system of record in the same way that like a CRM might be. And so ultimately, I feel like that needs a human owner, a human builder. And I think that because the LLM is better reviewing than it is at building, I think there really still needs to be a person there. So I'm very bullish on the future of people in FP&A is kind of my closing comment here. Looking at the chat, I see, like a lot of kind of like agreement on, system of record and audit trails, checking the AI's work. If you notice like other workflows where you feel like you've leveraged AI in a particular framework of like AI is a great intern but bad analyst, it's a good associate but bad VP, I'd love to hear more and more about those use cases. I just love learning about those more myself. Pivoting now to kind of like the 500 plus employee organization, I think this starts to be where things start getting much more layered, much more enterprise grade. And I think there is a ton of room for automation and improvement and modern tooling here. I think this starts to be like, if we survey the data, like some of these orgs have 40 to 100 plus FP&A folks. These are like deep hierarchies with many levels. And I think this, at these orgs, I do expect that AI is going to lead to a lot more kind of like consolidation and asking more from fewer folks. And I think, that can, mean one thing for people who are kind of doing the same workflows, but for, folks like you all who are like interested and curious and engaged in kind of like how leading companies think about team building, how they think about workflows, I do think there is also tremendous opportunity there as well. I think this also be also like team specialization, like the treasury function starts to be like a real function. There's like more like systems engineering work that's going into finance as well. Obviously, the FP&A and accounting teams are starting to get bigger and bigger and bigger. You might be more multi-entity, multi-continent. You might have multiple ERPs in different places, lots of subsidiaries, and all of those things lead to additional complexity that I do think, still continue to need more people, because as I mentioned, you still need that kind of like human owner for each one of these systems. So with that, I kind of want to wrap a little bit on this section. Jack, I'm excited to invite you back to the stage. And so kind of like as we start thinking about building people, processes, and systems, now we're starting to move from, not just like who are the people doing the function, but now how do you know when you're at it? Like, let's say you are a org that has hit a new kind of like size or scale threshold where you think we need more resources. The current kind of like capabilities of the current team working how they work today isn't covering enough of this use case. We're getting stretched. How can we improve? I think this is probably like people, processes, and systems, I feel like CFOs everywhere kind of like use that framework all the time. I think it's like pretty well recognized at this point. And the idea is basically you need to make that change. How, like, what is the thing that you should change? Is it change the process and improve how you as a team come together to fix that problem? Is it systems? Should you be bringing on a new tool or switching tools or a different tool that'll better help you accomplish that task? Or is it a people thing? And the answer is just hire more headcount. So I think this starts to be kind of like a fun thing where, Jack, what we'll do is sort of like a couple of like live examples of how to think about these things. And along the way, I do want to touch a little bit on, my personal opinions of the role of the spreadsheet in a scaled org. What are the places where the spreadsheet is still critical? It's how we think, it's how we work. And deciding to abandon the spreadsheet because you think you need scaled systems often ends up just leading to more fragmentation where there is the scaled system, but there is this trickle of knowledge and ad hoc modeling and scenarios that live in a spreadsheet that now don't talk to anything else. So with that, I guess we can remove the slides and Jack, let's talk about sales tax. And maybe do you want to start just by motivating a little bit like how you kind of like came to this problem space, things that companies think about, and then we can go through a live example.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Craig. Excited to riff on this live with you a little bit. We'll be jumping into what is, I know, everybody's favorite subject, sales tax. It tends to get put on the back burner, especially in these early stage companies. But Craig, what you said about having a system of record for something as important as sales tax, where jurisdictions can audit you and they can demand money.
All right. Jack, I think you may have frozen there for a second. I think you're back now.
Dude. Am I back? Testing?
You're back.
All right, I'm back. Sorry, the office is having spotty Wi-Fi today, so I will be talking to my IT guy after this. But tell me if I go out again. So we'll be using Craig at Aleph, a real live example. So we'll walk through just a quick discovery of like what are you doing, how are you thinking about sales tax, and start to peel back the onion a little bit on some of this automation. So to jump right in, Craig, I know you're at Aleph. You're about 70 employees, Series B, right? So how many states do you think you have economic nexus in? So meaning you've crossed the 100K threshold.
Yeah, it'll be directionally. So we have economic nexus in a bunch. We also are fully remote as an org. So also have like nexus by, I don't know what you call it, by like headcount or by physical presence in a few more. So let's call it like 20 states. And you can also, Jack, you can define nexus for folks too who might be newer to that topic.
Hit a certain threshold in a jurisdiction, so either a state or a city. There's actually 13,000 jurisdictions just in the US alone, all with their different tax rules and rates and how they tax different products. SaaS tends to be more complex than most. And I think it's taxable in roughly 24 states right now. So there's economic nexus, meaning you've sold a certain dollar amount into that state. Most states, it's 100K. A couple like California, it's 500K. And then the other way you can achieve nexus is by physical presence. So that's what Craig mentioned. They're a fully remote org, meaning every time they hire somebody in a new state, they actually trigger nexus and they are liable to file and pay taxes in that state, even if they're below the economic threshold. So that's a bit on nexus.
Jack, so Craig, you say achieve. Yeah, you say achieve nexus like it's a good thing. I don't. For me, it's not a good thing.
Not a good thing at all. I know it's definitely something that you're not super excited about. So maybe I'll rephrase it. You hit nexus. You begrudgingly crossed that threshold.
Yeah, there you go. We triggered nexus. I think there's
triggered. Yeah, triggered. That's the perfect word. Well, okay. You said about 20 states with economic and physical combined. So what do you sell exactly? Is it pure SaaS? Do you have any professional services, implementation fees, any hardware components?
Pure SaaS, baby. I guess we do charge implementation in a few cases, premium support, like consulting option, but the vast majority of it is just pure SaaS.
Got it. Okay. So that makes the product taxability piece fairly simple. And sorry if I'm cutting out again. Tell me if you are having trouble hearing me. Okay, cool. So let's transition into more of the manual burden to hit on some themes Craig mentioned earlier about automation and knowing when to scale. Craig, can you walk me through like what filing looks like today for you? So you said you don't have a system, you do this manually. Like how long does it take you and how often do you do it?
Yeah, so I think for where we are, I think first the nexus by presence for us is pretty easy. So we use like Rippling as our HRIS, and we use like Aleph as our FP&A tool. So we have like a Rippling integration that lets me basically spit out all of the states where we have, like, for folks based in the US, like all of the states where we have physical presence. I think that part is like pretty straightforward. On the revenue side, basically what we do today is we do all of our like invoicing through Stripe, and Stripe has states, like billing states for everyone. So we also use Aleph to pull in like how much we build in each of those states. So I would say like at the state level, that's kind of how we do things. At the city level, local level, I think it's like a little bit of like, manual work. It's a little bit of like figuring it out. And the honest answer is that I personally like, it's like one click for me to refresh like the state and employee level stuff. But we do have like still like a fractional finance resource that does a lot of the filing. We basically like offload it to them, and they definitely bill us for it, but they lump it in with everything else. And at the end of the day, I probably don't know the exact dollar amount that we spend on getting that done.
Yeah, and that's I would say pretty typical for an org your size. The Rippling integration is nice. You can roughly see physical nexus. Still a little bit of manual work, but yeah, Stripe makes it fairly easy to pull at the state level. I think where things break down is, as you mentioned, at the city level. So what this means is Chicago, for example, taxes software. The state of Illinois does not. That's called a home rule jurisdiction, meaning the city has different rules than the governing state. Colorado has about 60 of these home rules. There's home rules all over. So that's where we typically see the manual approach break down, if you will, open up companies to some pretty significant exposure. And you're doing a mix of manual data pulling and sounds like some semi-automation combined with offloading to an hour, a billable resource. All
That's
right. Well, Craig, you're obviously a smart guy. You clearly know sales tax is a thing. You're doing your best to tackle it manually. Why haven't you bought a tool yet? What's the real reason?
I think it's really like, if you look at the places where we have economic nexus, it's been like few enough that if it's like whatever, like 30 local municipalities or like jurisdictions or like whatever it is, it's like a lot that are in San Francisco, it's like a lot that are in New York, like that kind of stuff. We've been comfortable so far just like manually running on a monthly basis, and that's been okay. And then as we sort of think about prioritization of like how big of a problem this is, it definitely like is a problem. It is growing this year in particular as more and more of a problem, but it's more one of those like everybody does everything, and how do we prioritize all these things?
Isn't that the story? Well, Craig, I won't grill you anymore here. I appreciate you being a guinea pig. I want to talk to the folks watching. So I bet a good chunk of you are in Craig's situation, meaning, you're between 50 and 300. We saw that in the chat. Finance team of, 2, 3, maybe 5 people. Side responsibility. but I want to share a little bit more about what we see in the data. So as companies scale from startup to enterprise, again, aligning with the chunks that Greg shared earlier, we see roughly a 50x filing increase as those companies scale. So that's roughly 2 filings per year, all the way up to 94 plus. Roughly 40 is the breaking point. Again, that's where we see at 2 to 4 hours per filing done. That's 80 to 160 hours per year of manual filing work that you are paying hourly for, that you're offloading. And again, roughly 5 to 10 million in ARR, company stage. The average company would have about 400K in potential back tax liability if not compliant. So again, I think that what I want to emphasize is the pattern we see over and over, that companies that come onto Anrok that start to automate this, is they manage it manually until they can't. And that can't usually shows up as a nasty surprise, meaning an audit letter, a due diligence finding before fundraise, or maybe a customer asking for a tax-exempt transaction and nobody knows how to handle it. The companies that plan ahead and get automated in this, I'd say, all-important system of record, it's all about avoiding that painful expense and cleanup down the road. So, Craig, I'm going to follow up with you after the show about this.
I love it. I love it. Amazing. So I think, with that, I think we've covered a lot of ground today in terms of, team building and shapes and sizes of different orgs. I hope this is really helpful from a benchmarking perspective in terms of where kind of a lot of your peer set is, how they're thinking about things. We chatted a little bit about examples of where, software automation and even approaches to AI can help kind of improve and build efficiency. And we even give kind of a live example of what are some of the triggers of where you might start to feel pain points. What are some of the places of when are you ready to prioritize having something? And I really do think, to Jack's point, a lot of those frameworks are really around how much time are you spending on a problem today? And at what point is it worth, investing some amount of cost to investigate what tooling or systems are out there to improve that problem to save you on, X amount, on a go forward basis. So I think Ezekiel, great comment there. Implemented a SaaS solution to calc and file sales taxes. It's a game changer. I think at the end of the day, if you're trying to stay lean as a finance org, you need to find ways to lean on automation. You need to find tools that have good fit for the process and isolate what are things that a person needs to work on, what are things that tooling can help with. And I hope these are really great frameworks. I think with that, I think because we've covered so much ground, I feel like we can probably wrap a little bit early. Today, we'll let everyone get back to their morning. If you're on the West Coast, their lunch. If you're on the East Coast, and we'll see kind of a couple links to share a little bit more if you want to learn more about Anrok as a potential sales tax tool. If you want to learn more about Aleph as a potential FP&A software, get to see a lot of AI enablement there. Please feel free to reach out. The last thing I'll offer is feel free to connect with Jack or myself on LinkedIn. I'll put mine in the chat. And thank you so much for tuning in. With that, we can wrap and leave it there. Thank you so much, all.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time.